for preparing.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Happy Sunday. Gagi's watching.
Yep.
She's not saying anything because she's there.
What a beautiful day.
We have one out of 3 kids here today. Others are in the books.
They're in the books. They're busy writing exams at the moment, so the next 2 weeks is going to be hard work for them. Ciao,
Morning,
welcome.
Claudia.
Hi, Claudia. Hello, Gagi.
Gagi says hello, trio of loveliness.
Oh, and there's Isabel. Hello, Isabel. Hello,
Gagi says hello.
Alta.
Hello, Gaga.
Good morning, guys. Welcome. Hello, Robbie. Hope
and
you're doing
Alta.
well, Alta.
Morning.
Robbie. What a beautiful day we have here in Durban today.
Thank you.
It just feels like clean and blue skies. Just really, really beautiful. There's Popsy.
Good morning, Popsy.
Thank you for joining us today. Half the crew's in the books, the exams, and so it's just us. But Ava might stay for the whole thing today, Ava. Wow, that's going to be interesting,
Why
guys.
do you have something to say today? Why do you want to stay the whole time? Huh?
9:30 in Germany, just 1 hour.
I just want to.
Hello, Lynn.
To-
And Lynn is back from Kilimanjaro, so she made it. I'm trusting
Hello,
you back in
Lenny.
South Africa already, Lynn, back at home. So yeah, well done, Lynn,
Well done.
and welcome back.
Champ.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do. Takes a lot of guts and a lot of preparation.
Amazing.
And, so well done, Lynn.
Ava's going to preach.
Oh,
You're going to teach like Daddy.
No.
oh, you're gonna entertain here between us. That's gonna be very
But if you're
interesting.
distracting, you might have to go. If
Oh.
you're distracting us,
Yeah, if you're doing that, pulling faces like that, then you might have
Maybe
to.
it's time for us to talk now. You can sit on your bum. Sit your bum.
Awesome. Well, guys, I think we'll just jump right in and get going. Awesome. Thanks, DJ. Alrighty. So last week we spoke about the evolution of mercy, and so what we're going to be doing today is going to tie into that, I think, quite nicely, and further explain the idea. So I'll take just a couple of minutes to run through what we discussed last week, in case you did not watch last week. I encourage you to do so if it tickles your fancy. But last week we spoke about the change in mercy, or we used the term the evolution of mercy, and we had a look at Moses' idea of God's mercy that we find in the Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. If you've read it, if you're familiar with it, you'll understand, you'll know that the Old Testament seems to be, specifically the Torah, seems to be a bit harsh. You know, it's not the kind of things, it's the kind of things you'll go to jail for, basically, following the Torah. You'll end up in death row, I guess. But the basic premise was that Moses had a specific idea of God's mercy. And so I'm going to give it to you in a very quick nutshell today, without going back to all the verses. But basically, Moses' idea of mercy was this. God gives mercy to those who love him. And to quote Deuteronomy, he destroys them to their face that hate him. So in Moses' idea of God's mercy, it seems to be something that's retributive, meaning that it's kind of tit for tat. You know, if you follow and obey me, it'll be great. If you don't, it'll be horrible. And you can spend your time reading the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and it's quite clear. But then we went to the book of Luke. In the book of Luke, Jesus kind of upsets the apple cart. Jesus is not talking to Christians, you know, he's not talking really to me and you here. He's talking to Jewish people. He's talking to people who grew up with the Torah. He's talking to those who, the little boys who by 13 had to know it, you know, had to learn it, who are very, very familiar with it. And so it would have been a very strange thing, I think, for them to hear what he said in Luke, and I think we read from chapter 27 until chapter 6, verse 27 to verse 36. And basically Jesus kind of sets a different tone for the idea of mercy. And it's, this is a very familiar passage. Love those who hate you. And already in there, you feel, this is a little bit different than Moses' idea. And you can read the rest. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who despitefully use you. And so on and so on. And then he goes to verse 32 and he says, look, if you only love them which love you, don't the sinners do that? And I like to rather say, don't those who miss the mark already do that? And, I'm wondering if he's including Moses here, who obviously had that type of, and basically kind of saying to us, look, Moses was great and we're thankful for Moses, but Moses missed the mark. And so you might at this point of that little verse or that portion say, okay, yes, but that's for us. We should love our enemies, but God, He can punish His enemies. But that's not where these couple of verses end. It ends by saying that we need to be merciful as our Father in heaven is merciful. And it ends by saying, because He is kind to the evil. So it seems to me, at least, to be very clear that there's some change in the idea of what it means to be merciful. Yeah. And I would like to say that it's not really God who has a kind of an awakening or a revelation of what He should be, and now He's something different. But really, it's just Moses' inability to see God for who He was. And if what we Christians claim about Jesus is true, we would want to follow His idea of God, which seems to be slightly different, right? So, in essence, what I would like to do, just to try and eliminate some ambiguity, is just to say that there's what I call Moses' mercy, which is, it's the mercy that Moses attributed to God, the kind of mercy that God has, but it really was Moses' idea. And then there's the mercy that Jesus shows, and they are very, very different. I think they are very different. I know that a lot of people try to reconcile them, and I have gone through those efforts myself, but I have concluded they are irreconcilable, and I have to accept that Moses did not see clearly, basically. So today, I want to continue along this line, and we're going to do the next couple of verses, basically just the next two verses, verse 37 and 38 of Luke chapter 6. So Luke chapter 6 and verse 36 ends off with this, and let me just read it for you. Verse 36, it says, "Be therefore merciful as your Father also is merciful." And he's speaking about God. And so Jesus is calling us not to follow the mercy of Moses, but really to follow the mercy of Jesus. So if you think about that encounter with the woman that was, we assume, caught in adultery, and the Pharisees pulled her out, and Jesus was there, and according to the law, what they needed to do to her is they needed to stone her. That was Moses' mercy. If she was great and she loved God, she would not have disobeyed, and we wouldn't have to stone her. We would love her and embrace her. But now that she hates God by not following and being disobedient to the law, now we're going to kill her, and we're not going to kill her nicely. We're going to kill her with stones. And Jesus kind of stops them and says, "Look, this is not how we should be doing. That all of us, or all of you, miss the mark, and whoever has no sin, whoever never misses the mark, should throw the first stone." And so there is one of the places in the New Testament, in the first century, where we actually see contrasted in one practical event, the contrast between the mercy of Moses and the mercy of Jesus. And so the call to us in the New Covenant, in the New Testament, as readers of the New Testament, or as Christians, as Christ followers or followers of Jesus, is to follow in the mercy of Jesus, not in the mercy of Moses. And I think this is a much bigger issue than what we give it credit. I think this is absolutely life-changing. I think most Christians I know live in the aggregate of these two. They are like Jesus when it suits them, and like Moses when it suits them. And I think God is actually calling us out from the type of mercy that's shown in Moses' time to something that looks much more like the type of mercy that Jesus puts on display for us. That's not easy. That's counterintuitive completely. And the next two verses deals, I think, with the explanation of mercy in a very, very, in a beautiful way. And so let me read these next two verses for you quickly. Verse 37 and 38 of Luke 6. Jesus, this directly after he says, be merciful like your Father has mercy, he continues and he says, judge not, and you shall not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it shall be given unto you. And then that famous part, a good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will men give into your bosom. For with the same measurement you measure, it will be measured back to you again. So, normally we'd use this for offering time, but it really has nothing to do with money so much. It's got to do with mercy. So if you see what's being painted here, where there's a pattern here, there's a little, there's a pattern here. He says, judge not, condemn not, and then he says, give and forgive. And so it's kind of like the two sides of the same coin, but it's in a judgment becomes condemnation. Like condemnation is the worst kind of judgment, and forgiveness is a better kind of giving. So both of them the one starts by being judgmental or by judging, and then the result of that ends in condemning someone. The positive side of this is that when we start to learn how to give to people, we eventually learn how to forgive people. So I'm calling today's message Jesus' Big Four, because I think these four things are way more important than what we might have estimated them to be. These are very simple things, I think. And as Christians, I think we sometimes end up in ritualistic requirements instead of coming back to Jesus' simple instructions. So let's talk a couple of moments just on the idea of judging and condemning. What would it mean for us to judge people? What, like in your estimation, Tor, like, what does it mean? What does, we never really know what Jesus particularly means by this word, but what would it mean? I mean, what does it mean to you if you had to judge someone?
I think it means our opinion of whether what they're doing is right or wrong.
Yeah.
Like deciding that what they are saying or doing is right in our eyes, or in what should be, how things should be done or said. So you being the decider if that person is right or wrong.
I mean, that's what judge means. To be the judge is the one who decides whether something is right or wrong. And so maybe that's at the core of what Jesus is trying to communicate here, that we are not the ones that should decide. And maybe a better word, maybe a better contemporary word for judging would be to discriminate. Because the root word for judging simply is to decide. Deciding is not necessarily a bad thing, but when you discriminate, you change your behavior because of your decision, because of what you see.
Because of your judgment.
Yes, because of what you see. Maybe let's use one particular person. You see how they behave, and you say what that person is doing is wrong, and that's a horrible person because of that, and not taking into account maybe why that person is where they are, how they've come to this place, why they've done what they've done, is because we don't have access. We just don't have access to other people's stories. And to stand on the outside and just to judge and say that's wrong, that's right, I think is something we do so easily as, especially, I think it's human, it's very human. But the problem with us Christians is that we often use the scriptures, or let me make this more clear, we use our interpretation of the scriptures to judge. So then we feel, you know what, it's not really my judgment. It's actually God's judgment. And so we feel more justified in judging, in throwing that verdict at people.
Yeah.
And we forget that, it's our interpretation of the scriptures. And we also forget that even Jesus himself, when he looked at the Old Testament scriptures, he realized that it was actually coming short in the way that mercy was to be distributed to the people around him. He made a statement at some point where he said something along the lines of, you read the scriptures because you think you're going to find life in what is written, but life really comes from me. And so I think we have a tendency, and this is where it can get really ugly, because we become justified in our judgment because we feel like we speak for God when we judge people. Let's, for instance, use something like, you walk around, you see someone smoking, or someone says a swear word, or whatever, something that's a taboo maybe for you in your life. That's just a trivial example. But and you make a judgment based on that because of some scripture which you somewhere pull, and concerning keeping the body healthy and looking after the temple. And being completely blind to the fact that you drink 2 liters of Coke every day, and it's also damaging you, and you might be sitting with diabetes, which you've caused yourself, or you're making it worse. And it seems to me that Christians tend to be more judgmental of people because they feel like they're acting on God's behalf, and they feel like God's behind them when they do it, and they kind of feel like they're actually doing God's job for him
because they feel like God is constantly judging.
Yeah, I think that's the key here, Tori, because I think the way I realized one day that I might be a very judgmental person, and that I've always justified that judgment side of myself by, I'm actually, I'm judging on God's behalf. Like I'm helping him sort out the wheat from the tares, the goats from the sheep, and then as I became like a little bit aware of that, I later on realized that I was distributing Moses' mercy everywhere. And in the last about 7 years of my life, I've realized that I need to switch to Jesus' mercy. I can't hold on to Moses' mercy. I can't let it direct my life. I can't let it be the measuring stick with which I engage people. And I mean, I've been a pastor for a very long time, and I think it affected the way that I was around people, because I felt like it was my job to be the judge or the person in control, and cutting out what should be cut out in the church and keeping what should be kept. And I think it actually affected me negatively in a very large sense. But yeah, so I think we do as Christians, many of us, we hold to the idea of Moses' mercy, which then allows us to be judgmental. I mean, what's more normal than being judgmental? If you read the Old Testament, if you read the Torah, if you read the 5 books of Moses, that is absolute normal procedure. But Jesus comes and he just upsets the whole thing, and he says, you've heard it say, but I say, love your enemies. And so he creates a completely new landscape for us, in which he actually then, and Paul would also later echo this statement of Jesus, don't discriminate against people. Maybe racism is a form of that discrimination, but it's only one form of discrimination. There's many forms of discrimination. And when we discriminate against people, it seems like we decide that we have the right to say that is wrong and that is right. And actually the Matthew version, Matthew 7, I think, the Matthew's version of this portion includes another little portion which says something along the lines of, can you please take out the massive piece of wood out of your own eye before you try and take out the splinter out of other people's eyes? And then Jesus uses the word, you hypocrite. Paul says it like this. He says, when you judge others, don't you know that you're actually busy judging yourself? And so it seems to me like all of these things point in a specific direction. It's pointing in the direction that is not our job at all. Because the moment we point a finger, there's 4 fingers pointing back at us, as we normally say. And we need to become free from living in that space where we're constantly delivering a verdict on other people's actions, their behavior, their choices. We don't know their story. We don't know their story. When I think, just coming back to this, to me it was a life-changing little account of the woman. The Pharisee says, kill her. They don't ask questions. She did X. Because she did X, she's worthy of death.
Yeah.
Jesus doesn't do that. He says to her, I don't condemn you, go and sin no more. In other words, try and live a better life. Go and don't miss the mark in this area. But it just seems to me like Jesus takes into account, this is a person that's walked a certain journey. You don't know why she's in that industry, why she's doing what she's doing.
Yeah.
You don't know what her dad was like. You don't know the road she's taken. And to me, that is the demonstration of mercy in that moment. Is to not discriminate based on what someone has done, but to give everyone that same gift of mercy. And so I think this is why the opposite of judge here is give.
Yeah. You can either live from a place where in every interaction you come across, your priority or your goal can be to give, or your goal can be to judge.
Judge.
It's one or the other.
And in that sense, in this context,
Coming
judging
out.
really means to take. So you're really taking something from when you judge someone, a family member, a guy on the street corner, boss at work, whoever it might be, you're really taking from that person. You're robbing them of their personhood and you're reducing them to their actions. And you know how horrible it is when people do that to you.
Yeah.
We all know how terrible it is when people judge us on an action we did. They don't know our motives. They don't know what happened in the moment before that. They don't know what we've been struggling with for the last 10 years that led to the point where we maybe burst out and say or do something we shouldn't be doing. And to be discriminative or to be judgmental is to take away the history and take away the story and just reduce the person to that moment. And it seems that in this little portion here, we're talking about the big fours of Jesus: judge, condemn, do not judge, do not condemn, but give and forgive. It seems like the opposite of being judgmental is to give people. In other words, to afford them something. The gift of mercy is to, in that moment, say, I'm not going to come to any conclusions about this person, about who they truly are. I'm going to give them the benefit of the mercy of God through my life. And in context of what we've been saying, we're saying we're not going to give them the mercy of Moses because that's a stone on the head. We're going to give them the mercy of Jesus, which is, I do not condemn you.
Because we need mercy.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely. And that's
and
why
it just boils down to just
yeah.
living towards people as
you would
love
want
them
people
to
to
live
live
towards us.
towards
So we don't
us.
want to be judged, you know.
You know, the worst thing about being a judgmental person is you eventually live under your own judgment. That's where you end up. It starts off by you being judgmental of others, but eventually you have to live under that same judgment, and it's a crushing weight. Oh, wonderful! It's a crushing weight that it's really, really hard to bear, and of course, depending on type of personality types. But what I would like to talk about just for a moment, Tori, is the idea of judging, or the difference, or the progression from being judgy and then going towards condemning people. Because it seems like the idea of condemning here is to pronounce someone guilty and to, enforce a verdict upon that person. And Jesus condemns both of these things. In other words, he's saying, don't judge people, but also, for heaven's sake, do not put the stone to someone's temple.
Yeah.
And how do we put the stone to people's temple? By, maybe let's use a simple example, see an action, internalizing it, come to our own, idea about why that person did that. We take their story from them, reduce them to that action, and then we go and we pick up a stone. And how do we pick up stones? We go to person Y and say, you know what, that X is so A, B, C, D, E. You know what he did or she did, A, B, C, D, E. And we condemn them, and we do that, and we spread that judgment. And you can actually affect someone's life, I think, quite severely by doing that type of judgy
Yeah.
type of life.
Yeah.
I think also the other thing is a lot of, just from my own experience, it took me a while to realize that I actually was judgmental. It's not something that was obvious to me because of the culture I come from and the type of God I think that I envisaged.
Yeah.
This was perfectly normal and perfectly acceptable. And I just didn't take Jesus serious enough to change.
Yeah.
And I end up judging others, I end up condemning them eventually, and I truly believe that weight comes kind of back to you. Because if you read these two verses, the kind of lesson from it is, whatever measure of these things you use, judgment, condemnation, and then the opposite, giving and forgiving, whatever your measurement is, a teaspoon or a big bucket, it comes back to you. It actually says the following: shall men give into your bosom? Bosom is, the heart. It really means the mind. But in other words, it seems to me like Jesus is actually warning us that living this type of life comes back to haunt you. And it's not God that comes and says, oh, you've been judgmental all your life, now I'm going to be judgmental over you. People will do that to you. It's a kind of sowing and reaping type of lifestyle with sowing judgment and eventually having to live under that same judgment, which can be truly a crushing blow. And the sooner we realize that this is not the path we need to follow, this is actually not the God that we've come to know through Jesus. This is not his modus operandi. He is not what Moses tried to explain him to be. He is much larger than that. He is much more loved than that. I think that's the first realization we need. When we can come to that, we can start pulling away the dark clouds and start thinking about a life without those clouds and seeing a brighter and a clearer way of doing life. Now, that doesn't take away our habits, the way we've been trained basically and wired our entire lives. Now it's hard work to walk into a situation and not be judgmental of the situation or of the people in it, but to give the gift of mercy. So let's flip this to the other side. We've spoken about do not judge and do not condemn, but now to give here in this portion, I think it's got very little to do with offerings and money. But to give here, I really feel this is my way of explaining it. In the moment that you feel like you should be judging something and condemning it in someone else, in that moment you have a choice to either take or to give. And it's to have that mercy. It actually costs you something to be merciful to people, even when you feel what they're doing is not right or shouldn't be done. But to be merciful in those moments. Maybe another good example would be from the life of Jesus, where he's hanging on the cross and he says, Father, forgive them, they do not know what they are doing. Because in those moments, it should be words of judgment, it should be words of, what are these people doing? I condemn them. They are stand condemned because of what they've done. But in that moment, he chooses not to take, but in that moment, he chooses the path of giving. Giving of himself. And I think maybe we could say giving mercy. To those that are around him. To be generous towards others is not just arriving at a birthday party with a present, but to be generous in your thought pattern towards those around you. Maybe a simple way of putting this is giving people the benefit of the doubt in our dealings with them.
But you also create like an openness when you are giving. Like I just imagine when you approach something with a judgmental attitude, any situation, even if it's subconscious, you put up a wall. You put up and until you stop doing that, the wall gets higher and higher. And it might be in your personal life. You might have some churches might have walls up that it's hard to break through, or some people might have walls up because that judgment and that giving, it's like
releasing,
open, it's like letting down the walls and opening up a channel for love and for interaction.
We've dealt with this subject quite a while ago. I don't know if you remember, but psychologically they try and explain humans being judgmental by us having a type of a scarcity mentality. Like there's not enough for everyone to go around. In other words, I need to position myself to get the good stuff. And the way I position myself on top of others is I need to push them down. I need to highlight their faults so that I can feel better about myself. And that's kind of how psychologists, as far as I know, explain why we judge other people. But in that sense, giving means lifting up other people. And starting to believe that there's actually enough to go around. And also that you are good enough. You don't need to position yourself or posture yourself to get anything. Yes. But understanding that there's enough love going around, you don't have to put anyone down, but you can actually give by lifting others up because there is enough. Maybe that's a definition of grace, really, in the grace of God, that there is enough love for all of us. We don't have to fight about spots, you know, in church or heaven or whatever the case may be. We just don't need to do that. And coming from a performance mentality towards God, where it's actually, it stems from the ancient sacrificial systems where, you know, you've got to do something for God, then He will do something for you. You got to worship and praise long enough, then you will get a breakthrough. Or if you worship on a Sunday, God will fight for you. It's a mentality of, I have to perform for God to love me and to bless me and to do things for me. And I think we need to dismantle that completely.
So hard.
It is very hard because it's absolutely ancient.
Yeah.
It's absolutely ancient. And I don't think we have perfect freedom from that as yet, but I do believe that the words of Jesus continue to free us. You know, almost want to say, if I can use the cliche, the truth will set you free. But that's kind of what the Spirit of God, I think, does and is doing in humanity and doing in us. So the idea of mercy, or the opposite of judging people, is actually to be willing to give, not things. Things also maybe sometimes you need to do a gesture to show, but really to give in your perspective of them, to give them their story, to give them their history, to allow them to be according to their story and not to rob them of that. I think that's kind of important. And I think for me, that's really what mercy means, is to consider the other person and where they come from, and that there might be a reason why. There is a reason why they're reacting, doing, behaving.
Just as we have our reasons.
Exactly. And you know, it's so, you know, when you do something horrible, when we do something that's out of line, or we do justify it, but we so wish people would just understand why I did that. We so wish someone would just listen to hear of my pain that brought me to that place, but we don't afford others that same mercy, really. And I think that as we learn to be generous towards others, then I think the next step, just like judgment ends in condemnation and the writing off of people and pronouncing them guilty and sentencing them to no talking, no SMS, no WhatsApp, no visit or whatever, in the same way, as we learn to be generous and to give, we can learn to forgive, which these two words don't seem to be connected in the Greek, but the idea of forgiving means to set someone free, to let them go. And I think that fits quite nicely as an opposite to what condemnation means. Because condemnation is putting your judgmental hooks into someone, and that person can never be free of your viewpoint, your disposition, and your discrimination. In your mind, you've imprisoned them, right? And to forgive someone is to be aware of what they've done and to release them. And to let them go. And I think, once again, when Jesus says forgive them, they don't know what they do, I think that's an example of exactly that. And his words to the woman that they dragged in front of the Pharisees: I do not condemn you. I do not condemn you. I do not condemn you. And I think those words made me realize that God is not a condemning God. Maybe Moses' idea of God is a condemning God. Actually, in fact, not maybe.
He is, definitely.
He is. But not Jesus. And it's a huge mindset change to live in such a way.
Because like I said earlier, we feel like we're judging on God's behalf. Because he is busy judging everybody right from wrong and separating them in a group and doing this. Yeah. And that's why we judge, because that's our understanding.
We're sincere.
We're like an extension of that.
Yeah. But I think we realize also at some point in your life, you realize that your interpretation of things aren't always the actual thing. Interpretation of the scripture is not the scripture. And it's impossible to read the scripture without interpreting it. And so we always end up with some version of what we believe God is like, or what God would do, or what God wants, and what he approves and he doesn't. And if we take that on to such a degree that we now become judge on God's behalf, that's an issue. It's an issue because it is actually a place of taking from people. It's not a position of giving into people's lives and allowing them and setting them free. Because really at the end, and we've said this, but this is really what we all want. You know, this is really what we all crave. We all crave for people to understand us and not judge us just by what we do. To look deeper, to look below the surface, to why we are the way we are. And I believe the God that is the creator affords that to everyone. Because he put us here. We didn't choose to be here. We didn't choose to be born with a specific nature. It was handed down to us. And I think if you think about it in wider terms like that, it makes sense that he would be the one that's the most merciful towards us. We're not merciful towards one another, of course, because we want to get ahead and we want to stand out as better so we can get a bigger portion of whatever's out there. But the one who put us here, it's the same like siblings. Siblings aren't always merciful towards one another, but a parent is more merciful, tends to be more merciful towards the kids because the kids didn't ask to be there. And sometimes you look at your kids and you realize they like this because of what you are like yourself. So these are the four things, the big fours. I believe that I think they're life-changing, Tori. I think that if you take these seriously and you think about them and you internalize them, do not judge, do not condemn, but give and forgive. I think it'll change our view of who God actually is. Yeah. It'll challenge a lot of Christian dogma. And I think it didn't change your life for the better. And I think it will change the lives of those around you, become the beneficiaries of your mercy. Because ultimately these big four is really just one thing. It's just mercy. Yeah. It's just God's disposition towards his children. Is that he affords us, he gives us the benefit of the doubt, and he sets us free. He understands our story and takes it into account when he thinks about us. And our story is bigger. If you think your story is only 40, I turned 46 this week, but I've come to realize that my story is not 46 years long. My story is the story of my parents, their parents. My story is the story of the French Huguenots. My story is the story of humanity. I'm a product of everything. And I think if there's anyone that understands that and takes that into account, factors that in, it is actually God. We're the ones who can't or struggle with that. So I want to challenge you to also adopt the big four of Jesus. Don't condemn, don't judge, don't condemn, but give and set free. I think it's a way to live a better life. I feel like I'm a happier person since I've started to apply that in my life. And on every scale, hey, like in relationships, in friendships, in marriage, in groups, in family, church, especially church, any form of community, everywhere. If you can start shifting your mind in all your spheres of life, I think there'll be so much more peace. I think it's really what it is at the end of the day. It's God asking us to see each other as he sees us. And we tend to do that automatically. The problem is just how we think God sees us. Because we're holding on too much to Moses' viewpoint. living in the aggregate between Jesus and Moses. And just realize it's time to let go of Moses' viewpoint and to embrace Jesus' viewpoint. I think it would be a much happier life, more peaceful. Right? Guys, thanks so much for being with us on this beautiful Sunday morning.
Yes, have a good day. Thank you for being with us.
Yes, we have our next week we have a broadcast at 10:30, but then for 2 weeks the Duppies are going on holiday. And let me tell you the truth, since we've been in ministry, we've never been on holiday for 2 weeks as a family. And now we are able to do that, so we are going for basically the longest holiday we've ever been on since we got married, Tori.
Together life.
Yeah, our together life. So for 2 weeks, you might get a little, hello guys, how's it going at 10:30 on a Sunday morning. You might get it, but you're not
From France.
maybe. But
I might be in the beach.
but I might also be there.
From
But
there.
we're not going to do a formal broadcast. So if there's something, I'll let you know if there is something. But
But we'll see you next week.
from now on, we'll see next week, and then 2 weeks
Yeah.
we're going to be off. Guys, have a wonderful day. We'll
Thanks,
see you next
guys.
week. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye bye.